The email arrived at 7:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, carrying a digital stamp from the state probate registry and an automated flag from our firm's forensic audit engine. To anyone else in the office, it looked like standard corporate noise, an automated alert concerning an unlisted holding company named Asterisk Vanguard and Shield Limited, registered out of Delaware, tied to an estate valuation request. But I had spent 4 years staring at ledger patterns, shell company structures, and altered digital footprints. I knew the naming conventions. I knew the specific way my father's attorney structured subentities to avoid cross-jurisdictional state inheritance taxes. The primary beneficiary list attached to the trust's underlying asset portfolio listed 2 names, Helena Vance and Julian Vance *. My stepmother and her 32-year-old son, my stepbrother. The total valuation submitted for tax clearance was $14.2 million. The problem, and the reason the system had flagged it red, was that the backing assets listed in the filing belonged to an entity that had been legally liquidated 3 years prior during my father's 3rd corporate restructure. In plain English, someone had copy-pasted a dead company's property deeds into a live family trust to inflate its paper value, while simultaneously siphoning off the actual liquid capital into an offshore private equity account. It wasn't just a mistake, it was structured wire fraud, and my team at Miller & Vance Forensic Advisory had just been assigned by the state chancery court to audit the entire account. 8 months earlier, my father, Arthur Vance, had sat across from me at a sterile, high-end steakhouse downtown. He was a man who measured worth entirely by tangible assets, commercial square footage, machinery fleets, physical inventory. When I told him I was leaving my role at a mid-tier accounting firm to start an independent forensic auditing firm specializing in corporate asset recovery, he had laughed. It wasn't a mean-spirited laugh which made it worse. It was a soft, dismissive chuckle reserved for children explaining their imaginary games. "Forensic accounting, Leo," he had said, slicing through a piece of meat with deliberate, quiet precision. "You're paying a 6-figure lease on an office so you can spend your life checking other people's math. It's glorified bookkeeping." "It's not bookkeeping, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice flat. "We trace stolen capital. We track complex corporate structures, shell networks, hidden liabilities, and asset diversion. When people try to hide money, we find it. If someone takes money from a business, you call a lawyer and a sheriff," he said, waving a hand. "You don't hire a guy with a spreadsheet to play detective. Julian is running our new regional distribution plant now. Real operations, buildings, logistics, 50 trucks on the road, that's business. What you're doing is administrative overhead." I didn't argue with him. You don't argue with a man who believes the world hasn't changed since 1994. Helena had married him 6 years ago, bringing Julian along into the family dynamic. Julian was charismatic, well-dressed, and adept at saying exactly what my father wanted to hear. While I spent my 20s grinding through professional exams, corporate law certifications, and financial data analysis, Julian spent his position at Vance Logistics giving grand speeches about modernizing the business while quietly outsourcing key administrative functions to third-party vendors no one in the main office ever seemed to audit. Whenever I visited the family house, Helena treated me with a sugary, polite distance. She referred to my job as Leo's little consulting firm and routinely asked if I needed help making rent, always in front of Arthur. "It must be so stressful, sweetie," she would say, adjusting her gold bracelets. "Working so hard just to inspect other companies' paperwork." Julian was saying just yesterday how exhausting office work sounds when you aren't actually building anything. I never countered. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that the loudest people in the room are usually the ones hoping nobody looks too closely at the bottom line. Back in my office, the air smelled of stale coffee and hot laptop cooling fans. My lead senior analyst, Marcus, pushed his chair across the polished concrete floor toward my desk, holding a printed paper trial. "Leo, you need to look at this," Marcus said, tapping a red line on the printout. "The Chancery Court assignment for the Vance Trust asset verification. It's not just a standard review. The state flagged it because someone attempted to transfer the mineral rights of the old Miller Vance plant in Ohio into a blind trust." "Who signed the transfer document?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Julian Vance, acting as managing director of Vance Assets LLC, Marcus replied, "and the secondary signature authorizing the transfer of trust capital to an escrow account in Grand Cayman belongs to Helena Vance." "What's the date on the transfer request?" "Last Thursday, 4 days before Arthur's annual estate review meeting." I sat back, looking at the dual monitors in front of me. The node graph software we used to trace entity ownership was displaying a web of interconnected lines. In the center was my father's primary operating company, Vance Logistics. Branching off from it were 4 small, seemingly harmless shell companies. Over the last 36 months, small, consistent transfers, just under the $50,000 threshold that would trigger an automatic board review, had been flowing out of Vance Logistics' operational maintenance accounts and into these 4 entities. From there, the funds were pooled into Vanguard and Shield Limited. They weren't just managing the trust. Helena and Julian were bleeding my father's core company dry from the inside out, using the trust structure as a giant vacuum cleaner to siphon off liquid cash before my father's planned retirement at the end of the year. And because my father trusted Julian's real business operations and dismissed financial oversight as administrative overhead, he had signed off on every high-level authorization form Julian placed on his desk without reading the fine print. "Does Arthur Vance know this audit was assigned to us?" Marcus asked carefully. "No," I said. "The Chancery Court uses a randomized vendor pool for independent trust evaluations involving state-registered entities. The software picked our firm based on our licensing level. My father doesn't even know the state ordered an independent audit for the trust transition." "What do you want to do?" I pulled up the official court authorization form on my screen. Under state law, once a forensic team flags potential asset diversion in a court-ordered estate review, we are legally required to freeze all linked accounts, pending a formal accounting freeze hearing within 72 hours. "Issue the temporary administrative freeze," I said quietly. "Notify the primary trust bank, the chancery clerk, and the legal counsel of record." "Legal counsel of record is Vance and Associates," Marcus noted. "That's your father's personal attorney." "Send it to him directly," I said, "and make sure the notice goes to the trust's named administrators as well." The freeze took effect at 11:00 a.m. At 11:42 a.m., my cell phone began buzzing on my desk. The caller ID read *Arthur Vance*. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. "Leo," my father's voice came through the speaker, tight, loud, and laced with absolute fury. "What the hell is this absurd piece of paper my legal team just received from your firm?" "Hello, Dad," I said calmly, stepping away from my desk to look out the window at the city skyline. "You'll have to be specific. We handle dozens of filings a day." "Don't play word games with me," he snapped. "A formal financial freeze on the family trust, on my * accounts. Julian went to process a land acquisition payment for the new distribution hub an hour ago, and the bank told him the entire account is locked by court order under your company's name." "It's not just your account, Dad. It's the Vanguard and Shield entity," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "The Chancery Court mandated an independent asset verification for the estate transfer. When my team ran the valuation algorithms, the system identified major discrepancies between claimed physical assets and actual capital reserves." "Discrepancies?" Arthur barked. "It's a family trust, Leo. It's private capital. Helena and Julian have been managing that vehicle for 2 years to ensure the family's tax exposure is minimized. Julian spent 3 months setting up those offshore shields with our tax accountants." "Dad, those shields aren't minimizing tax exposure," I said, pausing for emphasis. "They are hiding capital movement. Over $3 million has moved out of Vance Logistics operational accounts into unlisted accounts over the last 3 years." There was a silence on the line, short and heavy. Then Arthur let out a sharp, bitter sigh. "You really couldn't resist, could you?" he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low tone. "You've been bitter ever since I gave Julian the management role at the logistics plant. You took your little paper-pushing degree, set up a glorified bookkeeping shop, and now the first time you get an ounce of bureaucratic leverage, you try to flex it against your own family." "This has nothing to do with family, Dad. It's a legal flag." "Cancel the freeze, Leo," he commanded, interrupting me. "Call the court, tell them it's an internal administrative misunderstanding, and clear the hold before 3 o'clock. Helena is frantic, Julian is stuck at the bank, and you are embarrassing me in front of my own attorneys." "I can't do that, Dad," I said quietly. "Even if I wanted to, federal compliance laws prevent me from lifting a flag once structured fraud markers are hit. A formal review hearing is set for Thursday morning at the Chancery Courthouse." "You are going to regret this juvenile stunt," Arthur said, each word spoken like a hammer strike. "I am coming to your office, and I'm bringing Helena, Julian, and my senior counsel. You're going to sit down at a table and explain to actual businessmen why you're wasting everyone's time." The line went dead. I looked at the phone for a second, then turned back to Marcus. Pull every transaction log for Vance Logistics from 2023 to the present, I told him, and get the certified bank records for the Cayman holding entity. They'll be here in an hour. 45 minutes later, the glass doors of my firm's lobby swung open. My father walked in first, dressed in his tailored dark suit, his face set in a hard, uncompromising line. Right behind him was Helena, wearing a beige trench coat, her expression a mix of high anxiety and performative outrage. Julian walked in last, wearing a sharp designer blazer, holding an expensive leather briefcase. He looked annoyed, but beneath the posture, I caught the subtle, hypervigilant darting of his eyes as he looked around our office, taking in the dual-screen setups, the compliance certificates on the wall, and the quiet efficiency of my 6-person staff. My father didn't wait for the receptionist to greet him. He walked straight past the front desk, pushed open the door to my main conference room, and stood at the head of the table. "Where are the papers?" Arthur demanded without preamble. "Let's get this ridiculous mistake cleared up right now." I walked into the conference room, holding a single black folder, and closed the door behind me. I didn't offer them water. I didn't ask them to sit down. "Dad, Helena, Julian," I said, bowing my head slightly. "Welcome to Miller and Vance Advisory." "Save the professional act, Leo," Helena said, her voice trembling slightly as she leaned against the back of a chair. She squeezed Arthur's arm. "Arthur, I told you this would happen. The moment we tried to secure Julian's future with the trust restructuring, Leo felt excluded. To use his job to freeze our personal family funds, it's malicious." "It's not malicious, Helena," Julian added, putting a reassuring hand on his mother's shoulder while giving me a cold smile. "It's just an inexperienced auditor trying to prove he's relevant. Leo, I get it. You see big numbers moving between corporate accounts and offshore entities and you think you've caught some Wall Street crime, but you don't understand high-level tax strategy. Corporate funds move through holding companies all the time to protect against liability." "Julian's right," my father said, folding his arms across his chest. "You're looking at standard corporate maneuvering through a microscope because you've never actually run a multi-million-dollar operation. You see a transfer, you think it's a theft. You don't understand how real business works." I walked to the head of the conference table, placed the black folder on the surface, and opened it. "I agree with you, Julian," I said smoothly, looking directly at my stepbrother. "Corporate funds do move through holding companies for liability protection. But standard tax strategy usually involves registering those entities under the main corporate umbrella, reporting them to the board, and maintaining audited records of the underlying assets." Julian's smile tightened slightly. "We have internal records." "You have PDF spreadsheets," I corrected gently, "which you generated on your personal laptop and emailed to Arthur's legal counsel." I pulled 3 printed documents from the folder and slid them across the glass table. They landed directly in front of my father. "What is this?" Arthur asked, frowning down at the pages. "That is the registration paper for Vanguard and Shield Limited," I said. "It's the Delaware shell company that owns the Cayman account, where $3.2 million from Vance Logistics was transferred over the last 36 months. "Yes," Helena said quickly, her voice rising an octave. "That's the family trust umbrella. Arthur authorized that." "Arthur authorized the creation of a family trust *," I said, turning my eyes to her. "He did not authorize the ownership structure of Vanguard and Shield Limited. Dad, look at page 2, section 4, beneficial ownership." My father picked up the paper, his brows furrowed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his reading glasses, and put them on. "Under Delaware state filings," I continued, speaking in a flat, even unhurried voice, "the sole shareholders of Vanguard and Shield Limited are not Arthur Vance or the Vance Family Revocable Trust. The sole beneficial owners holding 100% of the equity are Helena Vance and Julian Vance as private individuals." The conference room went dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning. My father didn't move. His eyes stayed glued to the bottom of page 2. "What is this?" Arthur asked, his voice noticeably quieter now, losing its aggressive edge. "Julian, what does this mean?" It's just a technical setup, Arthur," Julian said instantly, his face flushing a pale, blotchy red. He stepped forward, reaching out a hand toward the paper. "The lawyer in Delaware structured it that way temporarily to bypass state inheritance taxes until the main estate transfer was finalized. It's standard practice." "It's not standard practice," I said calmly. "It's a complete severing of ownership. Once those funds left Vance Logistics, they ceased to be company assets. They cease to be your assets, Dad. If you had passed away or retired this December as planned, those funds would not have gone into your estate. They would have belonged entirely and unreservedly to Julian and Helena, with zero legal obligation to return a single dollar to Vance Logistics or your primary estate. My father slowly looked up from the paper. His eyes moved from the document to Julian and then to Helena. Helena took a step back, her hand dropping from my father's arm. Arthur, darling, you know I don't understand these complex legal documents. Julian handled the filing details with the offshore attorneys. We did everything to protect *us. Protect who, Helena? I asked, pulling a second set of papers from the folder. Because while you were protecting the family, Julian was using Vanguard and Shield Limited to guarantee a personal credit line of $1.5 million with a private wealth firm in Miami. Here are the loan application documents submitted 3 weeks ago. I slid the final sheet of paper across the table. It was a copy of the loan guarantee. Attached to it was a personal financial statement signed by Julian Vance, listing the full $3.2 million of Vance Logistics diverted funds as his own personal liquid net worth. Julian stared at the page as if it had just caught fire. My father looked at the Miami loan guarantee. He looked at Julian's signature at the bottom, then he turned his gaze to me. For the first time in my life, Arthur Vance looked at me not as a son playing with spreadsheets, but as an expert who had just dismantled a bomb sitting under his foundation. Leo, my father stammered, his voice cracking slightly, is this real? It's fully certified by the Chancery Court Auditor's Office, Dad, I replied, folding my hands in front of me. The freeze isn't a mistake. And it isn't an administrative error. My team saved your entire life's work this morning. Julian took a step toward the door, his demeanor completely collapsing. Arthur, look, we can explain this. It's a miscommunication between the offshore accountants and... Shut up, Arthur whispered. Arthur, please, Helena cried out, her voice dripping with desperation. He's your stepson, we're your family. I said shut up, my father roared, slamming his heavy hand down onto the glass table so hard the black folder jumped. He stood up slowly, his chest heaving, his face pale as he stared at the two people he had trusted with his legacy. The confidence, the authority, the untouchable air of Arthur Vance seemed to shatter in an instant, leaving behind a man who realized he had been completely blind. He looked down at the papers on the table, then slowly looked up at me. Leo, he said, his voice trembling with an emotion I had never heard from him before. What happens next? What happens next, I said, keeping my voice measured and precise, depends entirely on whether you want this handled within the Chancery Court's civil framework, or if you prefer to let the State Prosecutor's Financial Crimes Unit take the lead. The room went completely still. Julian's hand was gripping the edge of the conference table so hard, his knuckles turned white. His polished corporate posture was entirely gone, replaced by the rigid panic of someone who had built a career on bluffing and just ran out of cards. Prosecutor, Helena gasped, her voice shrill, clutching the lapels of her trench coat. Arthur, tell him to stop. He's doing this on purpose. He's trying to destroy us out of spite. My father didn't look at her. He didn't even blink. He just stared at the dual signatures on the Miami loan guarantee, his thumb tracing the line where Julian had pledged his company's capital as personal collateral. How long, Arthur asked quietly, his voice dangerously low, how long have you two been setting this up? Arthur, darling, it wasn't like that, Helena started. How long, Julian? My father barked, his gaze snapping up to my stepbrother. Julian swallowed hard, looking toward the glass doors of the office as if calculating whether he could walk out. But Marcus was standing in the hallway right outside, holding a tablet with the real-time transaction ledger active on screen, quietly monitoring the situation. It was a restructuring strategy, Arthur, Julian stammered, his smooth charm dissolving into a frantic, high-pitched defense. The logistics plant had extra liquidity sitting in non-interest accounts. We were going to reinvest it. The Delaware entity was just a pass-through. A pass-through that named you and your mother as sole owners, I interrupted, sliding a third document across the table. With a secondary clause specifying that in the event of Arthur's death or retirement, all assets held by Vanguard and Shield Limited immediately convert to irrevocable personal trust funds, no probate review, no board oversight, no distributions to the core operating company. I looked my father in the eye. If you had retired in December like you planned, Dad, you would have handed the operational keys of Vance Logistics to Julian. Within 90 days, the company would have been facing an artificial cash flow crisis created by these missing funds. Julian would have proposed selling off the core real estate, the distribution hubs you built from scratch to save the business, and the buyer waiting in the wings to purchase those assets at pennies on the dollar. Vanguard and Shield Limited. Arthur's breath caught in his chest. He looked like he had been struck. He was a man who prided himself on reading people, on knowing every bolt and rivet in his business, on spotting weakness from a mile away. To realize that the two people sitting at his dinner table for 6 years had been executing a textbook corporate bust-out on his own enterprise hit him harder than any financial loss ever could. "You were going to bankrupt me," Arthur whispered, turning to Julian. "I built that company before you were 10 years old. I gave you an executive suite. I gave you 50 trucks, a salary twice the industry standard, and a seat at every major table. You gave me a job, Arthur," Julian suddenly snapped, his panic flashing into bitter resentment. "You gave me a title and made me run around playing operations manager while keeping every scrap of actual equity in your own name. You talked about legacy every single night, but who was listed on the real property deeds? Just you. Helena and I were always just guests in your empire. So you stole from it," Arthur yelled, taking a step toward him. "We secured what was owed to us," Helena shouted back, stepping between them, all pretense of sugary sweetness vanishing. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide. "I spent 6 years listening to you drag this family around, talking about how brilliant you were, how nobody understood real business except you. You treated Leo like an idiot because he picked books over trucks, but you were so arrogant you didn't even look at the signature pages on your own trust forms." The room plunged into an uncomfortable silence. Helena's words hung in the air like smoke. She had said out loud what I had known for years. My father's supreme confidence in his own physical intuition had made him completely blind to the paper world around him. He thought real work required grease, steel, and loud voices. He thought digital records and legal structures were just administrative noise, and that exact arrogance had handed his betrayers the pen to sign away his life's work. Arthur stood frozen, the color completely drained from his face. He looked aged by 10 years in a matter of minutes. He slowly turned his head to look at me. "Leo," he said, his voice barely audible, "you caught this." "My team caught it, Dad," I corrected gently. "Because we don't look at names or relationships, we look at data patterns. Data doesn't lie and it doesn't care about family loyalty." "What do we do now?" he asked. The man who had spent 30 years giving orders was now standing in my conference room, asking his son, the boy whose degree he had marked, what to do. "First," I said, opening my desk folder and pulling out a set of legal notices, "you sign this formal request for an emergency forensic audit of all Vance Logistics accounts. As a major shareholder, your signature allows my firm to initiate a full court-backed freeze on every secondary entity tied to Vanguard and Shield." Julian's eyes widened. "If you do that, the bank in Miami will call in the personal credit line. They'll freeze my private accounts." "That's the point, Julian," I said, handing my father a pen. "Second, Dad, you revoke Julian's administrative access to Vance Logistics immediately. Change the security codes at the main terminal today. Marcus has already prepared the board notification drafts." Arthur took the pen. His hand was shaking slightly, but as he pressed the tip to the paper, his resolve hardened. He signed his name with a sharp, heavy stroke across 3 separate authorization pages. "You can't do this, Arthur," Helena cried, reaching for his arm. "We can talk about this at home. We can fix this quietly." Arthur pulled his arm away from her touch, not with anger, but with a cold, absolute disgust that was far more damaging. "There is no home to talk about this in, Helena," Arthur said, his voice flat and dead. "You will leave the house by tonight, take your clothes, leave the car keys on the counter, the ones registered to the corporate fleet. Arthur, if you or Julian enter the headquarters of Vance Logistics after 12 o'clock today," Arthur continued, staring straight ahead, "I will have security escort you off the property in handcuffs." Julian took his mother's arm, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with a mix of fury and embarrassment. He looked at me, taking in my quiet posture, the neat stacks of paper on the table, and the glowing monitor behind me displaying the complete layout of his financial ruin. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Julian spat at me under his breath, "sitting in your little office with your little computer models playing hero." "I don't play hero, Julian," I replied evenly, meeting his gaze without a hint of emotion. "I'm an auditor. You left a trail of crumbs 3 miles wide because you assumed nobody in this family was smart enough to read a ledger. That wasn't a master plan, it was just lazy." Julian opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He pulled his mother by the shoulder, turned on his heel, and marched out of the conference room. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them with a soft, airtight click. The quiet that followed was heavy. My father stayed standing at the table, looking down at his signed authorizations. The noise of the city outside filled the space, distant traffic, the subtle hum of the office servers in the next room. "Dad," I said softly, walking over to the side of the table, "sit down." He didn't argue. He pulled out a leather chair and sank into it, resting his elbows on the table and placing his face in his hands. The broad, commanding posture he had maintained for as long as I could remember seemed to fold in on itself. "I didn't see it," he muttered into his hands. "Not a single sign. I thought he was running the plant, Leo. I thought he was out there on the floor, dealing with drivers, handling the logistics." "He was," I said, leaning against the edge of the table. "He was doing just enough real work to make the enterprise look healthy on the surface. That's how the best white-collar fraud works. They don't destroy the engine, they just tap into the fuel line and run a side hose into their own tank." Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He used my own signature forms. Every month he brought me folders of routine operational approvals. I signed them while sitting at my desk, eating lunch, talking on the phone. I didn't read a single line of the entity disclosures. I just trusted him because he was standing there in a suit talking about fleet expansions. "You trusted people you thought were on your side," I said. "That's human nature. It's why companies need independent oversight. You can't audit your own family with trust." Arthur looked at me for a long moment. He took in the sleek, functional office, the quiet focus of my analysts working at their terminals through the glass partition, and the piles of complex financial documentation neatly organized in front of him. "I called your work glorified bookkeeping," he said, his voice thick with shame. "At the steakhouse, I told you that real men build things with steel and concrete, and that you were just checking other people's math." "You did," I said, offering a small, dry smile. "You said I was paying 6 figures in rent to play detective with a spreadsheet." Arthur let out a ragged, self-deprecating laugh, shaking his head slowly. "If you hadn't played detective with that spreadsheet, Leo, I would have lost everything in 6 months. My trucks, my land, my reputation. I would have retired into a shell company that owned nothing while they lived in Miami on my life's work." "That was the plan," I admitted. They were 90 days away from pulling the trigger. Arthur leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "What happens on Thursday at the court hearing?" "My firm presents the full forensic report to the Chancery judge," I explained, pulling out a tablet and bringing up the schedule. "We present the trail from Vance Logistics to Vanguard and Shield Limited, the loan application in Miami, and the falsified property declarations. The judge will issue a permanent injunction freezing all assets tied to Julian and Helena's shell entities. The diverted $3.2 million will be ordered returned to your corporate accounts." "And the criminal side?" "The judge is legally required to refer the loan application to the federal district attorney," I said carefully. "Pledging corporate assets you don't legally own as collateral for a private loan is bank fraud, Dad. Julian signed that document under penalty of perjury. He's going to be facing formal charges before the end of the month." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, processing the weight of it. "And Helena?" "She's listed as an equal officer in Vanguard and Shield Limited," I replied. "Her signature is on the trust conversion papers. She won't be able to claim ignorance when the bank records show monthly transfers directly into her personal checking account." Arthur slowly nodded. He reached across the table, picked up the pen he had used to sign the audit forms, and twirled it between his fingers. "I spent 20 years thinking I was protecting this family by building something physical," he said softly. "I thought as long as the trucks were moving, the business was safe. I never understood that the real danger doesn't come from a broken axle or a bad driver. It comes from a line of text in a 30-page document that you were too tired to read." He looked at me, his expression earnest and raw. "I was wrong, Leo, about your degree, about your firms, about everything." "It's okay, Dad," I said quietly. "You built the company. It's my job to make sure nobody steals it." He stood up slowly, putting the pen back on the table. He straightened his jacket, though the commanding posture was different now, less aggressive, more grounded. Can I stay here for a while?" he asked, looking around the room as if he didn't want to step back out into the street just yet. "I want to see how you do this. I want you to show me every line of those records." I opened the conference room door and signaled to Marcus. "Marcus," I called out. "Bring in the secondary ledgers for Vance Logistics from 2023. Pull up the node graph on the main monitor." I turned back to my father and pulled out the chair next to mine at the head of the table. "Take a seat, Dad," I said. "Let me show you how real business works." By Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside Chancery Courtroom 402, was as cold and sharp as a scalpel. The vaulted ceiling and towering oak panels usually gave the room a solemn historical weight, but today it felt like a high-stakes operating room. On the left side of the aisle sat Julian and Helena, flanked by a court-appointed civil defense attorney who looked as though he had spent the last 48 hours realizing his clients had zero defense. Julian's designer suit was rumpled. The arrogant posture he had carried into my office 2 days ago was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, sunken stare directed squarely at the floor. Next to him, Helena looked exhausted, her fingers nervously twisting a cheap wire ring. All her gold jewelry had been documented as potential trust-funded assets and locked pending the court's decision. On the right side sat my father and me. Arthur wore a simple dark charcoal suit. He didn't slouch, nor did he glare. He sat with his hands folded neatly on the table, watching the proceedings with the quiet, intense focus of a man observing a complex piece of heavy machinery finally being calibrated correctly. Judge Patricia Vance, no relation to us, though the coincidence was noted with a brief wry smile from my father, took her seat at the bench. "We are here in the matter of the Vance Family Trust, State File 409, Judge Vance announced, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "This is an emergency hearing regarding an administrative freeze order issued by court-appointed forensic auditor Leo Vance of Miller and Vance Advisory. Mr. Vance, please present the findings of your preliminary audit." I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and stepped up to the podium with a single thin tablet in hand. No bulky binders, no dramatic speeches, just structured data. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Over the past 48 hours, my firm completed a full transactional trace of the liquid and physical assets held under Vance Logistics LLC and its affiliated entities from January 2023 through the present." I tapped the screen, casting our digital node map directly onto the large monitors mounted beside the bench and defense table. As shown on the screen, over a 36-month period, a total of $3,240,000 was systematically diverted from the primary operating accounts of Vance Logistics. These transfers were broken down into 68 individual payments, each carefully kept under the $50,000 threshold to avoid mandatory board notifications. I looked over at Julian's attorney, who didn't even bother to raise an objection. "These funds were routed through 4 unlisted intermediate holding companies," I continued, "and eventually consolidated into Vanguard and Shield Limited, a private entity registered in Delaware. Page 4 of the court-submitted exhibit clearly shows that the sole beneficial owners of this company are Helena Vance and Julian Vance." "Your Honor," Julian's attorney interjected weakly, standing up. "My clients maintain that this entity was created as an off-balance sheet vehicle intended for tax mitigation on behalf of the family estate." "Mitigation?" Judge Vance interrupted, looking down over her reading glasses. "Counsel, I have reviewed the supplemental filings from the State Financial Regulatory Division. Is it not true that your client, Mr. Julian Vance, used the full balance of this Delaware entity as personal collateral for a $1.5 million private credit line from a wealth management firm in Miami?" The defense attorney swallowed hard, looked at Julian, and slowly sat back down without saying another word. "Furthermore, Your Honor," I added calmly, "our audit revealed that the physical property deeds submitted to inflate the paper value of the Vance Family Trust belonged to a corporate plant in Ohio that was legally liquidated in 2023. The signatures authorizing the transfer of those non-existent assets into the trust bear the names of Helena Vance and Julian Vance, executed while my father, Arthur Vance, was hospitalized for minor knee surgery in November of last year." My father didn't make a sound, but I saw his hand tighten into a firm, solid fist on the table. Judge Vance spent 2 long minutes reading through the certified audit summary on her screen. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft, rhythmic hum of the digital projectors overhead. Finally, she looked up, her expression stern and unyielding. "The evidence presented by Miller and Vance Advisory is unambiguous, meticulous, and fully verified," Judge Vance declared. "The court finds clear evidence of structured asset diversion, falsification of estate records, and systematic corporate fraud." She picked up her gavel, her voice ringing out through the chamber. "I am ordering an immediate, permanent injunction. All assets held under Vanguard and Shield Limited are hereby frozen and transferred back to the primary accounts of Vance Logistics LLC under the direct supervision of court-appointed oversight. Furthermore, given the nature of the loan applications and the cross-border movement of funds, this court is formally transmitting this audit file to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District for immediate criminal review." Bang! The sound of the gavel striking the wooden block echoed through the room like a gunshot. Helena let out a sharp sob, burying her face in her hands. Julian sat completely rigid, his eyes wide with horror as two state bailiffs stepped up to stand behind his chair, ensuring he didn't attempt to leave before federal marshals could process the court's referral. My father slowly stood up. He didn't look back at Helena or Julian as they were quietly escorted out through a side door by their legal counsel. He turned to me, his chest rising and falling in a deep, steady breath. "It's over," Arthur said quietly. "The civil recovery is over," I replied, packing my tablet into my leather briefcase. "The money is back where it belongs. The rest is in the hands of the federal prosecutors." 3 weeks later, the morning sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. The firm had grown quickly following the publicity of the Vance Trust recovery. We had taken on 2 new senior analysts, and the whiteboards in our main workspace were covered with new corporate trace maps, institutional compliance audits, and asset recovery schedules. Around 10:00 a.m., the glass front door chimed. I looked up from my desk to see my father walking into the lobby. But he wasn't wearing his usual corporate executive suit. He wore a comfortable dark sweater, carrying 2 stainless steel travel mugs of coffee and a large leather-bound ledger under his arm. He walked past the reception desk, giving a warm nod to Marcus and the team, and walked straight into my office. "Morning, Leo," he said, setting one of the coffee mugs on my desk. "Morning, Dad," I smiled, taking the cup. "What's with the ledger?" Arthur sat down in the armchair across from my desk and opened the thick book. Inside were hand-drawn organizational charts, fleet maintenance logs, and financial targets stretching back 30 years to when he bought his very first delivery truck. "I'm stepping down as chief executive of Vance Logistics at the end of the month," he said casually, taking a sip of his coffee. I raised an eyebrow, "Retiring early." "Not retiring," Arthur corrected, a light glinting in his eyes. "Refocusing." I handed the operational directorship over to my senior operations manager, Sarah, the one who actually knew how to keep the trucks running without demanding a corner office. The board approved the transition yesterday. "And what are you going to do with your free time?" Arthur lifted the heavy leather ledger and set it squarely in the middle of my desk. "Vance Logistics is establishing an internal compliance and risk oversight committee," he said, tapping the cover. "And I want Miller and Vance Advisory to sit as our permanent external board advisor, but more than that, I want you to teach me." I stared at him for a second. "Teach you what?" "Teach me how to read the patterns," Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of the old stubborn pride. "I spent 30 years thinking that if I couldn't touch a business asset with my hands, it didn't exist. I was blind to half the world, Leo. You saved my life's work not with a wrench or a fleet of trucks, but with logic, data, and an uncompromising eye for the truth." He leaned back in the chair, a genuine, proud smile breaking across his face. "I used to tell you that forensic accounting was glorified bookkeeping," he continued softly. "I was wrong, it's light. You bring light into dark rooms where dishonest people think nobody is looking." I looked at the ledger sitting on my desk, then looked at my father. The distance that had existed between us for a decade, the gap between his world of steel and my world of data, had completely evaporated. "All right, Dad," I said, leaning forward and opening my laptop beside his ledger. "Lesson 1, let's go over how to spot an unauthorized shell company before it ever makes it to a trust filing." Arthur pulled his chair closer to my desk, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the glowing screen. "I'm listening," he said.